Question and Answer by L.G. Alexander. Lesson 35.
An unwelcome visitor. The doorbell rang and Mrs. Carson opened the front door. Her heart sank when she saw Mrs. Burbidge. Whenever Mrs. Burbidge called, she stayed for hours and hours. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carson," Mrs. Burbidge said. "I was just passing, and I thought I'd drop in to say hello." "How very thoughtful of you," Mrs. Carson replied. "Do come in." Just as Mrs. Carson had feared, Mrs. Burbidge stayed for several hours. It was nearly 6 o'clock, and Mr. Carson would be home from work soon. He couldn't stand Mrs. Burbidge. Mrs. Carson kept wondering how she could persuade Mrs. Burbidge to leave without offending her. "Has your husband got home from work yet?" Mrs. Carson asked. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Burbidge answered. "He always gets home about 5 o'clock. "It's nearly 6 o'clock. Won't he be getting worried about you?" Mrs. Carson said. "I thought of that," Mrs. Burbidge said, "but it's so pleasant here. We've had such a lovely afternoon. You know what I'll do? I'll ring up my husband and tell him to come round too. May I use your phone, please?" Answer these questions. 1. Who visited Mrs. Carson? 2. Was Mrs. Carson pleased to see Mrs. Burbidge? 3. Why wasn't she pleased to see Mrs. Burbidge? 4. How long did Mrs. Burbidge stay at Mrs. Carson? 5. Wasn't it nearly 6 o'clock? 6. Wouldn't Mr. Carson be home soon? 7. What time does Mr. Carson get home from work? 8. Mr. Carson can't stand Mrs. Burbidge, can he? 9. Couldn't Mrs. Carson persuade her visitor to leave? 10. Mrs. Carson didn't want to offend Mrs. Burbidge, did she? 11. Did Mrs. Carson offend Mrs. Burbidge? 12. Mr. Burbidge does get home at 5 o'clock, doesn't he? 13. Didn't Mrs. Burbidge enjoy her afternoon? 14. Why did Mrs. Burbidge want to ring up her husband? 15. Whose telephone would Mrs. Burbidge use?